Amen. So we're continuing our lesson today. We're going to start Samson, and we're going to be in chapters 13, 14, and if I talk really fast, maybe we'll get to 15. And let's see if we can do just a little bit of recap just to reset the stage for this week. So if we go back to last week, we covered Abimelech at warp speed. We had to go through that pretty quickly. And if you remember, we talked about Abimelech in the context of that's a continuation of the story of Gideon and the choices he made at the end of his time as a judge around setting up the ephod and basically creating kind of his own personal religion. And his choices that while he verbally denied being king, he did a lot of things that were very kingly in their regard. We talked about Jotham, who is a great example of how to deal with injustice. And if you remember, we talked about his example of how he spoke forth very plainly and powerfully, and then he left the judgment up to God. We finished Abimelech, and we talked about how his story ended, and we got into Jephthah, which is our next judge, and we talked about his background. We kind of explored his model of diplomacy, his great act of faith. And at the end of last week, we wrapped up talking about his vow, which is a problem for us, I think. It was a problem for me. And through that, we marveled at God's willingness to forgive again. And that's a lesson I have to relearn. And every time I relearn it, I'm impressed again and just so thankful for the God that we serve. We talked about his grace and his steadiness. And I think if there's ever been a year in recent history where we can all benefit and be blessed by a little bit of steadiness, it's been the last year. And just on a personal note, it's been difficult in a lot of ways, and I would encourage all of you, we can still use that difficulty and God's steadiness and our faith in him to be a great testimony to the people around us. I don't know how many times I've been able to say things. Someone's talking about 2020 and all of the negative consequences. And I'm able to say something very simple like, and I agree to everything you've said, and I have so much peace because I know my eternity is secure. And that creates a lot of fantastic conversation. So even through the difficulty, and I know I'm on a little bit of a tangent, but the whole point of all this is to remember the miraculous God we save. And even through trials and even through difficulty, we can still be a testimony to that. We ended the lesson last week talking about Jephthah's vow. And if you remember, before he went into battle, and the victory had already been assured by God. That's an important point. But before he went into battle, he basically said, God, give me this victory, and when I get home, whoever comes out of the house, I will dedicate to you and make them a burnt offering. And we explored a way out of that because that passage is like I said, it's a problem for us. I didn't find a way out. I didn't find any way to read that other than literally the way it was written. And we talked about some Hebrew grammar and we talked about some cultural things. And where I concluded is that it's still exactly what it says. And there's some important aspects that we also covered about that vow that I personally do not believe that God was in the vow. Just because we make a vow to God doesn't necessarily mean he accepts it. And I'm interested later, if anyone has a counter opinion to that, I'd like to hear it. But that's kind of where I'm at when I read through this. Just because we try to dedicate something to God doesn't necessarily mean that is a godly vow that God has now accepted. My theory is that Jephthah knew of God. We talked about the example of the history, but he didn't necessarily know God's character. I don't believe that Jephthah truly knew how to love God, how to honor him, and how to obey him. His knowledge is pretty selective, and that can be incredibly dangerous when we try to be selective about what we know about God in the Bible. And like I said, I don't think he really understood God's nature. He knew when to obey him, and he had a great example of faith, but the rest of it, I think, is an area that created that problematic vow that he made. unfortunately, it reminds me of a work colleague that I have, and he and I have had a number of conversations, and his denomination is very liturgical. They're very selective about what they believe in the Bible, and they're very selective about what they even acknowledge is the Bible, and it creates a situation where he does basically, while he thinks he's a Christian, he does what is right in his own eyes. And we have a lot of discussions about that, and I'm hoping I can continue to be an influence, because I worry a lot about that. So it's 1,000% plausible to me that Jephthah was the same way. He knew of God, he knew certain aspects. He did not really know his true nature, and that's kind of the root cause of the vow he makes. And it's a great reminder that one of the key lessons for me throughout all of Judges is that we are to admire the faith that is exhibited by so many of these characters. We're not necessarily called to admire them as an entire person. And I know I just griped at us about being selective, and I think this is a case where we have to be, because what the author of Judges is so often reminding us is that God uses ordinary, imperfect people to do extraordinary things through our faith, and we don't have to be perfect. God knows we are imperfect, and I'm so glad that He understands that. And that throughout all of these characters and Judges, remember, I still need Jesus just as much as they need the Savior. So do you, right? We are no better than they are. So be edified with the example of their faith, be patient with their imperfection, and recognize that we all have the same imperfection. Due to time, we just completely skipped chapter 12. I'll let you read and study that on your own. It's basically a little bit of a civil war with Jephthah's tribe and Ephraim. And again, here they show up again because their pride is hurt. That's the second example of them doing that in Judges, and we'll see a really stark example of that at the end of the book. Today I want to get into the story of Samson. So we're starting in chapter 13. And Samson gets more airtime in Judges than any other character. Samson gets 4 chapters. And I love, when we talked about Shamgar, I told you he's my favorite judge, and he only gets 1 or 2 verses. Samson gets 4 chapters. And they're lessons you can learn both from the brevity and from the length. And in this case, the author is building a story arc with Samson, starting from even before he was born. And where it's going to end in chapter 16 is we'll see how one man can basically be an invader to an entire country. So think about that story arc as we're getting into it today. So as we start chapter 13, the entire chapter is just an introduction. We don't even meet Samson until, I think this is the last verse in verse 24. He's not even born until the end of the chapter. So this is all set up. And it's a really amazing contrast, because our previous judge, Jephthah, remember, he was the son of a prostitute. He was kicked out and all these kinds of things. He was the head of a gang of thugs. Not exactly your typical hero. Now we come to the next chapter, and Samson is the opposite in terms of what we learn about his background, and I'll come back to that in a minute. A few interesting bits of context and background here. Remember, so Samson is from the tribe of Dan. Dan is on the Philistine border, and we've heard about Dan already throughout Judges. They consistently had struggles trying to possess the land. In chapter 1, we were told they could not possess it. In chapter 5, in chapter 5 when we talked about Deborah, and she mentioned some of the bench warmer clans, right? Dan was one of those bench warmers in chapter 5. And they'll make another appearance in the epilogue of Judges that's really significant. What else is different that we see here in the setup is that the period of oppression was really long. It's 40 years, right? So quite a long time. It goes over multiple generations. And by this point, when Samson's born, I picture this, it was probably some kind of military takeover, but really probably more of periodic skirmishes and kind of just a cultural takeover, right? The Philistines probably ran all the businesses, they probably set all the taxes, and they probably treated the Jews very much like second-class citizens. But it took 40 years for them to ask for a deliverer. And in fact, chapter 13, if I remember, doesn't actually say they asked. No one cried out for help. They'd been oppressed for 40 years, and no one cried out for a deliverer. I think based on what we said, or what we read about in chapter 2 in the prologue area of Judges, we can see by this time the moral decay has been very significant and very pervasive throughout their culture and throughout their conversations. However, Samson, their deliverer, he was called even before he was born in this case, even before conception. And we're told as we go through here that he was to be a Nazarite, and he would begin to deliver Israel. So already some really different aspects of this story compared to some of the other judges. The parents, I think, are really interesting. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but they're a little bit of a contradiction because they offered burnt offerings and grain offerings. They prayed. They recognized it was an angel of the Lord. They exhibited great faith, but they had to be reminded not to eat unclean food, which in Jewish culture and religion, that's a big deal. So it's an interesting contradiction where, again, they have some awareness and some practices and some knowledge, but it's not exactly their total lifestyle. There's some key elements that they seem to have forgotten. I want to spend a few minutes also and remind us, what does being a Nazarite mean? And this is significant, I believe, because we see Samson do a bunch of things throughout his story that are completely opposite of this and in contradiction to this. So I think it's important for us to understand what he should be doing and how it should be guiding his choices versus the choices he actually makes. And I think that understanding these aspects help draw a little bit more significance to the story. So the Nazarite vow, it's usually voluntary. It's a voluntary separation unto God. It can be made by a man or a woman, the vow. It's normally temporary, and part of the vow is to specify the period of time under which the vow is valid. The person making the vow must abstain not just from wine, but everything derived from the grapevine. That would include grape juice, grape skins, grape seeds, raisins, etc. The person making the vow must avoid contact with anything dead, including relatives, family members. If the vow is broken or you're defiled during this time through which you've set yourself apart, you have to go through a cleansing process, and then the vow resets. You got to start all the way over. So you want to be really careful about, once you start the vow, you really do want to keep it until the time period is concluded. The other thing is the person making or entering into this Nazarite vow must abstain from cutting their hair for that time, the period of time the vow is active. And once the vow ends, once you've reached the end of that time period through which has been stipulated as part of the vow, the hair is now cut and it's offered as a burnt sacrifice as part of the concluding act from that vow. So keep some of these things in mind as we go further into our text. So if we start in verse 8, kind of this 8 through 25 range in chapter 13, we see some indications that Manoah and his wife, as I mentioned before, they were godly people. They prayed for guidance. They never questioned the promise of a son. They had tremendous faith in this. And they knew they were not allowed to see God's face and live. So again, there's quite a bit of awareness. We can maybe say they're a godly family. But in verse 8, they had to ask, basically, what does being a Nazarite mean? How do we raise a Nazarite? What is that vow all about? So that leaves me a little bit conflicted. And one of my conclusions, one of my theories is that some of the practical aspects of worship had been lost through this tribe and this culture at this time. After 40 years of oppression, they remembered some of the stuff, but didn't remember most of it. It makes me kind of wonder, well, where were the Levites, right? They were kind of the keepers of these religious traditions, and they would have known all this. And so we have a family who is partially godly, but they've forgotten some of the key tenets. The author is quite keen for us to know that Samson was experiencing God's blessings even as he was growing up. This was not kind of a one-and-done episode of the Spirit emboldening Samson, right? This is something that would happen to him throughout his entire life. And towards the end of chapter 13, in verse 24 to 25, we're told that he grew, and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him while he was in Mahanadan between Zorah and Eshtaol. So that Spirit was beginning to stir in Samson even at a very young age, and it's interesting to look at the word choice they use. In other places, and we'll see this later with Samson, but in other judges we see how the Spirit either clothes or comes upon that person. We've kind of talked about what that means, is to really come to pass or to become. But here it's talking about how the Spirit began to stir Samson, and it's a different word choice, and it really means kind of to thrust or to kind of propel. And I believe it suggests it's more than just strength, and it's a little bit more about directing Samson's choices and his development and maturity. But it seems that the author is very important for us to understand that the Spirit was part of Samson's upbringing. As we wrap up chapter 13, there are a couple of things I want to make sure that we take with us. So we find a man born into a godly family, and we talked about why I kind of have a little question mark there. But we find a man born into a godly family, and that family sincerely desired to raise their son in fear of the Lord. Manoah and his wife truly exhibited that based on their behavior and their responses. Samson's birth was a little bit miraculous because his mom was barren until that point. We're not told how old they are, but we're told that she had been barren to that point, and now she was able to have a son. And that birth was announced by two visits from, and that's not angel of the Lord. The Spirit of God began to work in Samson at an early age, as we talked about that. So let's make sure we take that with us in the next chapter. And if I were to describe the background of a hero, what we would consider a true hero, I think this is the recipe for that. From a humanistic perspective, what are the kinds of things we look for? If we were going to build a superhero, miraculous birth, the Spirit stirred him at a young age, godly parents, raised in the fear of the Lord, a Nazarite vow, raised in a family that was part of a tribe that had been oppressed for 40 years. So these are all the ingredients of our superhero role model. Kind of reminds me of Clark Kent being raised by a bunch of farmers in Kansas, right? It's that kind of feeling to me. And I would love to spend some time and dive in what we think his childhood was like. We don't really have time for that, but it's maybe just something you can noodle on yourself. As he's the only kid in class that never cut his hair, right? And as the Spirit began to stir in him, how would he behave? How would he respond to when kids tried to tease him, or when they were trying to go to worship and he wanted to sleep in? All those kinds of things. It's kind of an interesting thought experiment to kind of go through. If we move now to chapter 14, we see Samson's version of the newlywed game. And for those of you who remember that TV show, it makes sense. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, ask your parents. But in verses 1 through 4, we see Samson sees a Philistine woman, and he seriously lusts after this woman. He's like, Dad, go get her for me. She is the one. The scripture doesn't tell us why he was in Timnah. It was a Philistine town close to the northern border of Judah. Maybe he was there for business. Maybe he was there trolling for Philistine babes. I have no idea, right? But his parents recognized, they tried to talk him out of it, and they recognized that if he went through with this, he can't fulfill his Nazarite vow if he marries a Philistine woman. I think his parents would have been pretty offended. And it makes me wonder if they had a conversation with him about, hey, you're going against God's will. You know, we've been told for generations not to intermarry, and I know we haven't listened, but now you're doing the same thing. And man, I would have loved to be a fly on the wall for that conversation. And this whole event was directed by God, and his parents didn't know that. God was looking for a way for Samson to create conflict with the Philistines. Right? Samson's call was to begin delivering Israel. So at some point he would have to enter into those conflicts. Verse 4 tells us his parents did not know this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines, for at that time they were ruling over Israel. And Samson's response best translates, when he says, she's the one for me. An accurate translation is, she is right in my own eyes. It's kind of a familiar theme we've been talking about in Judges. Another way to look at it is, she pleases me the most, or she pleases me very, very well. So some of that is kind of familiar. And there's another really interesting tangent here that I wish we had more time to get into. But, we could ask some tough questions on, all right, now wait a minute, Michael, you're telling me God was directing this, but he's also been telling the Israelites for donkey's years to don't intermarry. And now he's sending Samson to go marry a Philistine. In fact, the father refers to them as the uncircumcised Philistines. Right? Did God direct Samson to violate his own commands? Or, more likely, this is Michael's opinion, did God use Samson's own ungodly desires and use those in a situation that God was going to create anyway? We could spend weeks unpacking that. And so I just want to offer that question to you and let you wrestle with it in your own time. What I'll leave you with, though, is that God is unchanging. God's view of sin is unchanging. So anyway, maybe you can wrestle with that question around the dinner table tonight. As we move through chapter 14, we see now Samson has convinced his parents or intimidated them or whatever. He won the argument, right? And they're going to go to Timnah and they're going to, meet the family and start the whole process of the dowry negotiations and all that kind of stuff that would have been characteristic in those days. So in this passage, we see their journey from their town to Timnah. And this is kind of how I see the journey going, because it says they traveled together, but then Samson's very famous episode with the lion strongly suggests that there was some distance, right? He wasn't with his parents. They weren't walking next to each other, right? There was some separation. So it's about 10 miles from Zorah to Timnah, so it would have been a few hours' walk. They're going to meet the new wife's or the soon-to-be wife's family. And they were traveling together, but as I said, apparently there must have been some distance between them. And don't miss the fact that it said, as they approached the vineyards. So what was a Nazarite doing messing around in the vineyards? Right? Nazarites are supposed to abstain from wine, anything from the grapevine, grapes, raisins, grape juice, whatever. Anyway, God enabled Samson to kill, it's referred to as a young lion, was roaring and charging Samson, right? So these were still kind of wild times, apparently. And when it says young lion, what it means is a lion in its prime. Okay, so this is a fierce, strong creature. This is not, well, anyway, it's a lion in its prime. And in verse 6 it says, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, he's talking about Samson, so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands as he might have torn a young goat. Another way to read that is he tore the lion apart with his bare hands as easily as if it were a young goat. I struggle with this a little bit, not from a spiritual perspective, but just from a practical perspective. I don't tear up a lot of goats. Never fought a lion. Trying to figure out, this is just kind of one of those really weird stories that I think if you're in that culture, probably makes perfect sense. I could maybe draw some parallels to when they would prepare animals for sacrifice, how they would slice the throat to drain the blood, etc., etc. And a lot of commentary suggests that when it says he tore it apart, it's not like physically pulling the entire animal apart, but really refers to tearing out the throat. So anyway, might have been something that made sense, but in our current generation of, iPhones and internet and air-conditioned buildings, tearing up a goat's not something a lot of us do. If you do, come talk to me, because I really want to know. I really want to know what in the world that's all about. But it also makes me ask, what is this scene for? That's kind of a weird story. They're on a journey. Samson decides to go wander through the vineyards. He gets charged by a lion in the vineyard, and he tears it apart. And then he goes back and doesn't even say anything to his parents. And okay, maybe I get that, but if you tear an animal apart, I'm not a rancher, but I think there's a lot of blood involved. So what happened with all that, and how did he walk back to his parents? And anyway, it's just kind of a weird thing. But this story, I think, is kind of an encouragement or a sign, probably to Samson, to remind him of God was with him, right? This is, just before this, Samson is about to enter into that story arc of escalating conflicts with the Philistines. So I interpret this as a reminder to Samson of his role in God's plan. Maybe it's a little bit of a practice or a warm-up. We're not really told what was happening before that, but if Samson was out trolling for dates in the Philistine city, maybe God needed to remind him a little bit of who he belonged to. Maybe there are elements of all of that in the story, but to me, what's really interesting, like I said, is how he didn't tell his parents what happened. And I think, we can unpack that in two different ways. One, he didn't tell them because he just touched something dead, and that would have to reset his Nazarite vow. And he probably couldn't be fussed to do that. Or he didn't really care about the vow that much. That's one way to interpret it. If you assume good intentions and you assume he's a 100% man of upright, godly character, you say, well, maybe he was just really humble. And he didn't want to reveal his power too soon, lest he become a target for the Philistines. I think we'll see more of Samson's nature in later passages. I think that answer will be made clear if you haven't already decided. So they go meet the wife's family. They come back. Sometime later, after a period of time, they're on their second journey because they're now going for the wedding feast. Okay, so all the negotiations have been done. Now they're going to actually have the wedding feast. And there's a lot of weirdness here about how Samson wants to go see the lion that he killed, which suggests kind of some pride maybe. And he scoops honey out of a carcass. What's that about? Now, trust me, if you start looking into this, set aside some time because you can really go down a rabbit hole. There's a whole thing about how bees don't like to be around dead things. They're not vulture types of insects. And but there's one species that eats flesh in a certain time of the season and blah, 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 blah. That's all kind of interesting. I don't think it's spiritually relevant. I can pretty quickly get to a point where it's like, okay, maybe a hive was on a tree and it fell down and broke open. Maybe murder hornets came in and killed the bees and it's dripped down onto the carcass or whatever. I think it's kind of an interesting, weird story to talk about around the dinner table. The spiritual significance, though, was not really that the bees were in the carcass, right? And by the way, carcass, this was probably a year or so after the first trip. So don't imagine a rotting, fleshy kind of lion. Imagine bones that have been picked clean by an arid environment and insects, not bees, because they don't eat flesh, but other insects and vultures and animals and stuff like that. So it was likely just a skeleton that was left. And if our Nazarite buddy wasn't unclean from the initial kill, he now scoops honey out of this skeleton, and he's certainly unclean now. He has broken his vow. There is no debate about that. And he gives some honey to his folks. It doesn't tell them where it came from. I mean, I kind of think they might have been interested to know where he got it, but so now he is also unknowingly, or I think he knowingly gave unclean food to his parents who unknowingly ingested it. So now everybody's unclean. Are these the actions of a hero? Go back to the setup, right? When we talked about our recipe for the ideal hero. I would submit no. I don't think they are. But I also don't read anything too sinister into this. I don't think he was like, "Muah ha 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 ha, I'm gonna, break my vow and I'm gonna make my parents unclean." That's not the picture I get. I think of this young, prideful, brash young man who's hungry, who loves honey. He says, "Hey, yeah, let me go check out that line. Oh, look, honey, let me have some." I think he was just in the moment. I think it was an impulse decision. He probably just didn't really care that much about the vow, didn't take it seriously, probably thought his parents wouldn't care. I think it's nice he shared. He shared with his mom and dad. That's a nice thing. But, he shouldn't have broken the vow, but he did. He did so willingly. I believe he did so knowingly. And I think that tells us a little bit about his state of mind. Yeah, Chris.
One thing that comes to mind as you explain that, it kind of reminds me of Esau. And he was hungry, coming in. Give me some of your stew, Jacob, or I'll perish. He didn't care that much about his birth. And so he makes that trade as if it's a small thing.
You mean men do stupid things when they're hungry, Chris? Really? And other reasons, yeah. So for those of you who couldn't hear it, Chris was drawing a parallel to the story of Esau, where he was famished and he gave his whole birthright for a bowl of stew, right? So there's a little bit of a parallel. So Marty, did you have or Ken, someone else had a comment? Yeah, Ken.
I guess everybody has a picture in their mind of Samson and why he was like he was. I kind of see him like the preachers do, that he didn't have a choice about him. His parents chose him, and he may have had some resentment about that. The expectations that came with not being like everybody else, not drinking wine, not cutting hair, etc. And on top of that, he was a bodybuilder. And so he probably had a pretty good rebellious streak in him. And he wasn't afraid of anything. He'd go to the list here whenever he wanted to. He'd walk through the vineyard, grapes there. He wasn't supposed to touch anything there. To show him he was his own man. He could do whatever he wanted to. And on top of all of this other, think about the incredible strength that he had. And so I just kind of see him as somebody who has something to prove. And maybe showing people he didn't have to act a certain way just because he felt he had to act a certain way. And so, I don't know if that's true or not. That's kind of the picture I have of him in my mind. Person he was.
That certainly fits the context. And for those of you who couldn't hear and those of you listening online, Brother Ken was kind of echoing some thoughts around why Samson was maybe this way. And he drew some parallels to kind of preachers' kids and, how normally the Nazarite vow is voluntary and Samson didn't have a choice. So maybe he was chafing against that a little bit. I mean, I know most young kids always love following rules and always love doing exactly what their parents say and love being exactly what their parents want them to be, and no one but Samson has ever had issues with that. And, Ken offered some other comments around, he would have been incredibly strong. Maybe he felt like he had something to prove. No one was going to pick on him. And I would also submit everyone probably, at least in his area, everyone probably knew who Samson was. If he didn't stand out because of his long beard and long hair, he probably would have stood out because of how the Spirit was moving through him periodically through his life. So I think we have maybe some ego. I think we have some pride. I think we have a little bit of rebelliousness. And all of that would kind of fit how we're reading how Samson behaved at this time. So moving further into chapter 14, we get into a charming story about a wedding feast. Except, remember, this is the book of Judges, and so this wedding feast ends with 30 guys getting murdered in a town nearby, and the wife actually given to someone else because her husband runs off in a furious rage at the end of it. So, welcome to the book of Judges, right? the picture I want to paint at the early part of this passage is kind of a typical Near Eastern type wedding festivity, right, which would have gone for multiple days. There would have been fairly extravagant feasts. The men and women probably would have been separated and entertained in different either areas of the house or different houses or tents, depending on where they were. Would have been a lengthy process. There were probably some negotiations about a dowry happening during this time, and there would have been a formal engagement, and from that time on, that Samson and his wife would have been referred to as husband and wife, but they hadn't been consummated. They had not consummated the relationship yet. So the feast, what I'm picturing is kind of an ancient version of a bachelor party for Samson. I'm sure there was drinking involved. Makes me wonder how the Nazarite behaved during all that. We can draw our own conclusions. I think the fact that Samson didn't bring any friends to the wedding feast. It was only about 10 miles away, so a very doable journey, even on foot, especially if it's, hey, come with me and you get to eat free, really good food for a whole week, right? I'm going to tear up goats every day. He didn't bring anybody. So it makes you wonder what would have been going on. Were the Israelites really chafing finally at the Philistines, and were they really starting to remember that they weren't supposed to intermarry, and now this guy's going to go make trouble and marry a Philistine? And, we're not told in the scripture about that, but I think it's really interesting that he didn't bring any friends. It was him and his mom and dad, and that's it. That is very atypical in this culture. Very atypical in that culture. In fact, in verse 11, we're told that when the people saw him, they chose 30 men to be his companions. And we can read that a couple of different ways. First, it's kind of like, oh, isn't that nice? They want him to have friends. Another interpretation could be maybe his family was quite wealthy and this was a sign of respect, right? But if you look a little bit deeper, right? Remember, whenever the Bible tells you something weird, go lean into that a little bit. Go figure out what that means. And what I would suggest to you is that when the people saw him, right, the Hebrew word that's used is not like you looked at something as it passed by. Read it more like the people saw and perceived Samson. They saw and understood Samson, a mighty man of strength. I think they assigned 30 people out of fear. I think they were bodyguards. Well, not bodyguards for Samson, but bodyguards for everybody else. Again, you can interpret that lots of different ways, but when you really look at how the Hebrew word is used, what I submit to you is that the Philistines were a little wary of this guy already. As we continue on in this chapter, we're told that, there's the famous story of the riddle. Now, telling riddles at feasts like this would have been quite common, but Samson includes a pretty audacious bet. It's basically 1 on 30. So Samson is really sure you're never going to guess it. Now, after being frustrated for several days at not solving it, the companions, right, they're really nice gentlemen, they threaten to burn the wife at the stake if they don't get the answer out of Samson and tell him. Really nice guys here. So she pesters Samson. There are tears involved, and there's guilt trips and all this kind of stuff, and Samson finally relents. She tells the companions they know the answer, and so now Samson has to pay up. Now, if up to this point you had any opinion that Samson was smart, I submit to you that when he refers to his wife as a heifer in verse 18, he is not a smart man. In verse 19, we see Samson march off to Ashkelon, which is 20 to 25 miles, let's call it 24 miles away from Timnah, kill 30 dudes, grab their ceremonial clothes, and bring them back to his wedding. 24 miles, a fast walk, you could do it in a day. Now, this is kind of weird. He was bound by hospitality and bound by the marriage covenant not to kill her family and her friends or even people in her town. So he's like, well, I got to go somewhere where they don't know her. So that's part of why he goes to Ashkelon. Ashkelon also is interesting because it was down on the coast, and it was one of the 5 capital cities of Philistine. So it was pretty significant that he basically marched into one of their capitals, kills 30 people, steals their ceremonial garments, and brings them back to pay up his bet. So I expect it made quite a statement. What I'm picturing is that Samson barged into another wedding feast, maybe a festival for, maybe they were celebrating with one of their pagan rituals. Samson marches in, does what he does, grabs 30 sets of clothes, and takes them back to pay up his bet. And, remember, God was directing this to stir up a conflict. And I think a brash, egotistical, overpowered Samson was exactly the kind of person God was using to really, really, really stir this pot. And it's kind of interesting. Think about you're the 30 companions. You're like, ha, 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 we got the best of Samson. He disappears, and he comes back, and he starts throwing down 30 bloody sets of wedding clothes. I think he made a real statement when he came back. I don't think it was graceful. I think it was probably something very boastful. I'm kind of envisioning they're all eating, and one by one, he's throwing down a set of wedding clothes in front of each person. There's probably blood on those clothes, I'm guessing. Anyway, I think it was kind of a big deal. And I think Samson was making a point that you won the battle, but you just started a war. After he pays his debt, then we're told Samson is furious, and he stomps off. He feels betrayed. He's furious. The wedding is called off. But it's not just I stubbed my toe and I'm kind of angry, right? This is a deep down fury that Samson is now feeling. It's described as a burning wrath, okay? And it happened after the Spirit came on him and presumably left, right? Remember, the Spirit, as we're told and described in the Old Testament, it's not a permanent indwelling, right? It kind of does the hokey pokey. It comes in and then it comes out sometimes. I would submit that in this case, the Spirit enabled Samson to do what he did to stir up the conflict, and then it left him, and then all that was left was Samson, and he was ticked, right? He was mad at his wife for her treachery and unfaithfulness. He was mad against his companions for their deceit. I think he was mad against the citizens who all laughed at him, at being tricked. After this, we're told that the wife is given to another companion, right? They hadn't consummated their marriage yet, and that was to help restore some honor for her and the family. And when Samson returns to his father's house at the end of this chapter, I would have loved to hear the I told you so conversation. One took place. It's like, gee, Samson, we kind of told you, uncircumcised Philistines, you ought to pick one from, our people, and they don't deal with us the way we deal with each other, and you can't trust them, and yada, yada, yada. So I think that told you so conversation, I think it happened, and I think it was probably pretty entertaining. We're going to stop there. Next week we'll get into chapter 15 and 16. We will finish the story of Samson next week, so if you want to read ahead, that'd be great. And let's close in a word of prayer, please.